The domestication of horses was nothing short of an equine revolution in transportation, traction, trade, and war. It was the complete transformative package of civilization. When the multifaceted power of the horse was finally harnessed, it permanently altered the fabric of humanity and laid the foundations of history. Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrok Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is historian and author Timothy C. Winegard. Tim grew up in the small town of Brights Grove in southern Ontario, next to the city of Sarnia on Lake Huron. He served for 9 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, during which he completed a master's degree from the Royal Military College of Canada and a PhD from the University of Oxford when he was stationed in the UK. He's been professor of history at Grand Junction's Colorado Mesa University since 2012 and coach of the men's hockey team since 2014. He's written numerous books. Notable among them is The Mosquito, A Human History of Our Deadliest Predator. Today he joins me for a discussion about his latest book called The Horse, A Galloping History of Humanity. Timothy C. Winegard, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
You're from the small town of Brights Grove in southern Ontario. I want to start by asking you what life was like growing up in that part of Canada.
It was kind of an idyllic childhood on the shores of Lake Huron, and it was dominated 100% by hockey. My life revolved around hockey and my family, obviously. But I wanted to be a professional hockey player, and that was my goal. And I guess it kept me out of trouble, so that was a good thing for my parents, I suppose.
In Saskatchewan, where I grew up, it didn't matter how small the towns were, they all had some kind of little ice hockey arena. I imagine it's the same in small town Ontario.
Yeah, so we had, I think, well, in my town, no, my little town was too small for an arena. We don't even have a stoplight. But Sarnia is like 20 minutes away, and it's 80,000 people. So there was 3 or 4 rinks in Sarnia. So I grew up like playing in Sarnia, and then went on to play junior hockey. So, but yes, it was certainly dominated by hockey, and I coached the hockey team here at Colorado Mesa University, where I teach now as well, so I get the best of both worlds.
Sarnia is quite close to Detroit. It's closer to Detroit than it is Toronto. Did you grow up cheering for Red Wings or Detroit Lions?
So I grew up a Wayne Gretzky fan, first and foremost. But yes, I was a Wayne Gretzky fan, but my teams are the Red Wings and the Lions as well. Yeah, those are since I was a little kid. And the Red Wings were terrible when I was younger, and then got obviously very good for 6 years. And the Lions have always been awful until the last few years. So I'm a suffering Lions fan, but they're starting to turn it around a bit here.
When I was a kid, I watched Tim Allen's show Home Improvement, and he had Detroit Lions, some kind of poster or something on the wall, and I liked the blue and silver, so I started cheering for the Detroit Lions.
Yeah, I watched that show too. So yeah, Sarnia is about an hour and a quarter, hour and a half. I mean, straight north of Detroit. It's right on the bottom of Lake Huron on the Michigan border.
I'm interested to know what books influenced you when you were younger.
So again, in my school that I went to didn't have a library. So every week the bookmobile would come, which is essentially a big RV on wheels that would come from the bigger library and put some books in there. And so I remember being my grandfather fought in the Second World War, and my great-grandfather fought in the First World War and the Second World War. And my great-great-grandfather fought in the Boer Wars and the First World War, all for Canada, obviously. So the librarian, when I was in kindergarten in grade 1, grade 2, she would bring me books and set them aside, specifically kids' books on the World Wars. because I was fascinated listening to my great-grandpa talk about that, and my grandpa as well. I got to know them both very well. So I was fascinated with, I guess, military history from a very young age based on my own family's service in Canada's wars. So my great-grandpa died when I was 11, and my grandpa just died a couple of years ago, actually. So I got to know them very well and was just fascinated by, my great-grandpa's stories of being in the trenches in France at 15 years old. And I mean, crazy, crazy stories. So I was, and my parents just promoted an atmosphere of learning, whether that was classical music or, learning to play the piano or the guitar, and reading as well, but mostly military history books. I also like those little Mr. books. You like remember those tiny, it's like Mr. Long, Mr. Fat, there was a whole series of little Mr. books that I liked as a kid too.
Some of your early books that you wrote about the Oka crisis, and book about Canadian Indians in the First World War, and also oil in the First World War. So that interest translated to your professional career as a historian. I'd like to ask you how you went from the topic of the First World War to writing a book about the mosquito.
So the mosquito was my fifth book, as you know, and the horse my sixth. So the Oka, I remember as a kid watching the Oka crisis on TV. I would have been, 12 or 13 years old. And my grandma grew up on the Six Nations reserve outside Caledonia, and my grandpa's from Caledonia. And there's a lot of indigenous communities around Sarnia growing up too. So I was kind of immersed in the culture, I guess. So that was the Oka crisis. I was just fascinated by it. And no one had ever written about it in the right way, I suppose. Looking at both sides, there was a lot from the indigenous perspective, but not a lot from the Canadian government or certainly the military perspective. So I tried to bring both to the table. And then with the next books, combine kind of military history with indigenous studies. So after the oil book, the First World War is kind of my, I guess, lifelong love as far as a historical episode goes. Again, back to my great-grandfather. So after the oil book in the First World War and how oil shaped the First World War and the century that's followed, my dad and I sat down and talked about, I wanted to write what I call an airport book. So the books you always see in the airport, there's only a select few. So you get Guns, Germs, and Steel and Sapiens, these Mary Roach's Grunt, or these kind of general books for the masses. I call them airport books because it's the only ones that are ever in those stores. And so we sat down, and my dad's a medical emergency doctor. He's a physician in Sarnia. And he jokingly said, well, malaria is making a comeback. You should write a book about malaria because it's global and and I just said, yeah, I'll write a book about the mosquito. And once I started researching, it kind of became a no-brainer because no one had written about the global historical influence of this tiny little animal in shaping human history through the vectoring of these diseases. And again, it's not the mosquitoes so much as that causes harm at all. It's the pathogens that hitch a ride via the mosquito. So I started researching, and it became quite apparent that this story, one, had never been told, and two, was, off the charts fascinating as far as the impact that this animal has had in shaping the trajectory of our civilizations and our global shared history. So, the mosquito obviously had a lot of success that I certainly wasn't prepared for, nor did I expect. And I can say that, like, with all humbleness, I didn't expect to be a New York Times bestseller and a Canadian Globe and Mail bestseller, LA Times, and be published in 15 languages around the world. It was quite overwhelming, to be quite honest. So after that, again, kind of brainstorming with my dad about things in history that we often kind of overlook from an external non-human source that have had such an impact on history. And, we like to kind of believe we make our own history, or that is some wonderful, men and women and superheroes of our national and international stories that we give credit to, when more often than not, it's luck or it's an external factor that changes the course of certain events, whether that be the mosquito, climate change, certainly some other disease and kind of landscapes. But trying to think of one particular thing like the mosquito, there was a series of events that happened during the COVID lockdown that kind of led me to get thinking about horses. One was I was driving somewhere and I passed my neighbors riding their horses, and then they passed some kids walking. So I started thinking about our primary modes of transportation. And then I was walking my dog another day, and he was sniffing the horse manure pile on the side of our street, because our neighbors, they go horseback riding all the time, but on Sunday mornings they go with Coronas in their hands, and I think it's the funniest thing. They're like just trotting down the street with their cowboy hats on and the Corona on Sunday morning. I'm like, heck yeah. So he was sniffing the manure, and I was thinking about, prior to the internal combustion engine, the amount of manure that would have been in these huge cities during the late 1800s. And so that was kind of another, just, I guess, prop or event that happened. And the final one was I was missing watching the NHL game. So this would have been in March 2020. And I turned on ESPN 8, the Ocho, and it was broadcasting live from Leadville, Colorado, which is about 2.5 hours east of where I am in Grand Junction now. And it was ski joring, which is a person on skis being pulled around a track by a horse and rider. And it was live because it was outside. And I said, all right, I got to write a book on how the horse shaped human history. So it was a series of, I guess, fortunate events in the Lemony Snicket sense that got me to kind of restart researching this more in depth. And again, it became very clear that there'd been so many books written on horses, but none quite as succinct or broadly looking at the historical influence of horses. I mean, and again, it's a no-brainer because they've always been here, so we kind of just blithely overlook their importance because we almost see past them instead of seeing them when we look at historical events because they're so omnipresent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved the approach that looked at the evolution of the horse, the bone wars, and how in the 19th century we started to discover the evolution of the horse from a scientific perspective, but also about this bond and relationship where they're working with us or for us in war and in agriculture and in transportation. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere throughout history. I guess let's start with the evolution. Human beings first domesticated the horse in an area of the world called the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which is eastern Ukraine, southwestern Russia, and western Kazakhstan. The horse evolved in North America, but when Europeans came to North America, there were no horses here. So how does all this work out? There are migrations that occurred? So the succinct version is, yes, the epicenter of equine evolution is here in the United States, in what are now the states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, the area I am in really right now. And so it started off as a 10-pound creature about 60 million years ago called a Hyracotherium, with multiple toes on its feet, 3 on the front, 4 on the back. And it's an earlier ancestor, which we don't know, we haven't found, would have had 5 toes. So 60 million years ago, it's roughly 10 pounds the size of a fox, and it bounded more like a deer. So this animal crossed the Bering Strait, and also at this time you could cross via the Canadian Arctic islands, Greenland, Iceland into Europe that way. There was 2 land bridges at this time when Pangaea's kind of slowly breaking apart. So it continued to evolve in Eurasia, and then these species would die off while the mainline evolution of equus kept happening in North America. So eventually modern equus evolves here as the climate changes from more jungles and forests into grasslands. We develop more of a modern horse with 1 hard hoof, which is better for running on hard, like steppe grasslands. And it eventually, modern equus spreads all over the world.
And then beginning kind of 30,000 years ago, we have something called the Quaternary extinction event, or the Pliocene extinctions, where large mammals go extinct pretty much all over the world, and specifically in the Americas. So 85% of the large megafauna and flora go extinct in the Americas, and this includes the horse, the modern horse. So the horse is extinct by about 9,000 years ago in the Western Hemisphere. And by 4,000 BCE, so about 6,000 years ago, the horse is extinct everywhere in the world, save for that tiny pocket of grasslands within the larger Eurasian steppe that goes from Hungary, Eastern Europe, Hungary, all the way to the Pacific and China and Mongolia. The Pontic-Caspian steppe is a slice of the larger Eurasian steppe. So that was the only place, aside from a handful of herds in Central Europe, that horses existed. So they're a later domesticate to our barnyard collection, simply because they existed in such few numbers and in such a very localized region that was pretty inhospitable to humans. So eventually we domesticate these horses 3,500 BCE. And according to some anthropologists and archaeologists, we likely saved the horse from complete extinction across the planet by reining them in from domestication, or from extinction with this domestication. So the Yamnaya culture, or in what we know as Indo-Europeans, were the first and only people to domesticate the horse. It's a single site origin domestication, we think.
Yeah, I found that really interesting, that by domesticating the horse, that human beings likely saved it from extinction.
Yeah.
In these waves, oh, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but when we think about then, and I get it's an exercise in futility because it's what if history, but imagine what our history would have looked like if there were absolutely no horses in our history, or making our history alongside with us. It's kind of unfathomable to think of that, how our history or our modern world order would look now if we erased horses from our history. I mean, that's kind of a crazy, almost kind of a chilling thing to think about. And of course, we wouldn't know what our world would look like, but it certainly wouldn't look the way it does now. And that's really the purpose of the book.
Yeah, well, all the major events over the last 4,000 years or so that scaled up the size of our societies, and or the production of agricultural yields to feed growing populations, to innovations and all of this stuff, the horse is right there alongside with us, and is one of the prime movers, helping us with energy output. It's an interesting counterfactual to think about, but at the same time, it's really hard to imagine what would have occurred had we not domesticated the horse.
Yeah, we certainly wouldn't have the population densities we have, our empire building, the spread of ideas and technology and spirituality, disease, human DNA, everything. It literally was as you just said, the prime mover, or the invisible hand driving the progression of human civilizations across the world. And it is quite remarkable what this animal has done for our species, both literally and figuratively elevating our species and circumventing our own biological constraints as human beings. When we combine the two of us together, our brain and its strength, speed, size, and stamina is an unparalleled and unrivaled partnership.
Yeah, I liked that line. It summarizes just how perfect an animal it was for a relationship with human beings in so many ways. Picking up on something you just mentioned there, let's talk a little about the pan-Indo-European spread of culture and how the horse was a major contributor to that. Where did that language and culture originate, roughly?
There's new theories that it might have come out of Turkey. The original, like Proto-Indo-European, came out of Anatolia and then came north as a dialect into the Caspian and Pontic-Caspian steppe. Or it originated itself in the Pontic-Caspian steppe with the Yamnaya culture or Indo-Europeans. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because the extended spread of Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European was a direct repercussion of the domestication of the horse. So if we want to look for the homeland, it may be in Anatolia and maybe in the Pontic-Caspian, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because it would have remained localized anyway had it not been for the domestication of the horse. So it's kind of a futile, I mean, academics like to bicker and banter about this kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because it's Indo-European peoples who domesticated horses and then spread their language across greater Eurasia, and their DNA and recreational marijuana smoking, the invention of pants, tattooing, the folding camping chair, paternalism, militarism. I mean, I can go on and on. So 48% of the planet currently speaks Indo-European because the horse literally had the ability to get the word out, and the word was Indo-European. So they controlled trade routes. They created a huge empire that went from the Atlantic Ocean, I mean, all of Europe, including the UK, across Europe into the Indian subcontinent, and then all the way to what is now Xinjiang province in Western China, where we had Indo-Europeans speaking their dialect called Tocharian, which is now extinct. And we find them, the Terra mummies there, distinctly Indo-European, wearing pants. So because they had domesticated horses and nobody else did, I mean, they were able to conquer, and it was not benign. They were able to conquer a huge kind of loosely, very loose, but Indo-European empire, and empire in the sense of shared culture, not so much like the Roman Empire. There was no centralized bureaucracy or anything, but they were able to spread their culture and language and all the attributes they possessed, for better or worse, across Eurasia.
What you just described, the Proto-Indo-European culture spreading across Eurasia with the domestication of the horse, seems like one of the most important events in the history of humanity that this occurred.
Yes, in the sense that it was fostered by the horse because they were the only ones that had horses, and they were very militaristic, and this was not a benign process. And if we look at the DNA landscape across Eurasia, we see that all Y chromosomes in Europe all belong to these marauding horsemen right now. So if you have European DNA and you're a male, then you have that DNA, which means local. Old Europe, in a sense, was completely wiped out from a cultural and genetic standpoint, and linguistic standpoint, save for Basque, Finnish, Hungarian, Estonian, and those languages are not Indo-European. So there's still a handful in Europe that are, and obviously Sami as well. Those are original languages. They're not Indo-European, but every other language in Europe is. So yeah, and the Indian caste system was created by Indo-European conquest. So it really is one of the most important events in human history. And I think that's why there's so much bickering over when horses were domesticated, where, by who, and whether these people were Indo-European or not Indo-European. And it's a very contentious, there's a lot of contentious and hot button issues regarding horse domestication, which I won't bore the listeners with. But on that note, we're still discovering things all the time that change the timeline and change. Again, I mentioned the Anatolia theory of Proto-Indo-European. So there's a lot of different theories and hypotheses, and they kind of merge, always seem to merge in the Pontic-Caspian steppe is the best way to put it.
You wrote about how we think the domestication of the horse first happened and how the first person to ride a horse, what that might have looked like. But what was the primary reason for domesticating the horse? Was it to ride it?
No, it would have. I've gotten a lot of flack for that, actually, because I said it would have been a young man. And it would have been a young man. It doesn't mean I'm misogynistic or the fact that women don't have a role in or a voice in history, or they're not recorded. Lamenting the fact doesn't change that fact either. And so it would have been, because you're not going to try to approach or tame an animal or approach a 1,200-pound, 1,000-pound animal if you're not familiar with its habits and its movements and its behavior. So it likely would have been a hunter who did this. Now, in Indo-European culture, the males hunted, the females didn't. So it would have likely been a male. But anyway, so it was for meat. It would have been for meat like every other animal we domesticate or tame. They're a literal livestock of meat. So it would have been for meat and milk, and then secondary products of the horse that they made everything from. They used its bones and its sin, like the indigenous peoples of North America and the bison. They had 150 different uses for every part of the bison. The horse was dissimilar. However, they realized from archaeological evidence, Indo-European peoples realized very quickly the unique and pragmatic and utilitarian attributes of this animal very quickly. So when we look at the DNA structure of horses tracing backwards, we can see selective breeding happening almost immediately upon domestication for a more docile animal and a flatter back, which would have made it easier to ride because it would have dispersed the weight across the horse's back instead of directly on its spine. It also would have provided a more comfortable seat for the rider because this is before the invention of saddles. So very quickly, we think they were riding and using horses to pull wagons, and then by 2000 BCE to pull chariots. And that's the invasion into the Indian subcontinent, is Indo-European chariotry for the most part, which is also written about in Indian texts.
When did the stirrup first get invented?
So I liken the horse, I say this in the book, as we think of it as an organic animal, which it certainly is, and it's a magnificent, noble, powerful, regal. I mean, they're amazing animals, but we have to think about it more of as a living machine. And so what happens is, just like we upgrade our cars with different features today, or we upgrade our cell phones with different garbage we put on there, hopefully no social media, but we upgrade the potential of the horse through amendments too. So when we think of saddles, bits, like bits in the mouth, and then reins, saddles, harnesses, horseshoes, stirrups. So we have armor, and then obviously attach it to chariots and plows and wagons and omnibuses and trolley cars and everything else. So most of these inventions actually come out of China. Between 200 and 500 CE, we see most of these inventions: the horse collar, the trace harness system, whippletrees, which makes the pull of the horse even, so you're not jerking it. It's the things you see across the reins that we don't think about. Those little wooden or metal pieces, those are called whippletrees, which make sure when the horse pulls, you're not wasting the horse's energy for what's being pulled. It keeps it from shifting to side, so it's an even distribution of horse pull energy essentially on what's being pulled. They invent those, and then they invent the stirrup, and the stirrup quickly spreads to Korea and Japan, and then makes its way across the Eurasian steppe to Europe by the late 6th century.
When I was reading about the dispersal of the Indo-European culture, I thought there are some comparisons here to the 13th and 14th centuries, how the Mongol Empire was able to expand across Eurasia. Do you see any comparisons between how those two cultures spread?
Yeah, they're both horse-driven. As we know, the Mongols, their whole culture revolved around horses. I mean, they learn how to ride horses when I learned how to skate, so 1.5, 2 years old. And they learn how to shoot on horseback. They learn, the whole world revolves around horses. They use them for herding their sheep. They use them for food. They use them for milk. I mean, they are a paramount horse culture in global history. So certainly there's some similarities to draw there, but there's more differences, I would say, than similarities, because the Mongol Empire itself was a very sophisticated, centralized, bureaucratic empire and administration with uniform laws across the Yasa, uniform laws across the Mongol Empire, uniform tax rates across the Mongol, very low taxation rates to stimulate free trade across the Mongol Empire. So when we look at the Mongols, they get a bad rap as kind of being this heathen barbarians streaming out of the steppe to conquer Eurasia and the biggest contiguous land empire in the world and the second biggest empire anywhere in the world next to the British. It's not really a fair assessment of the Mongols. And when you really look more deeply at their empire and their willingness to adopt other cultures into their systems and into their laws and into their military. I mean, the Mongols had a navy. A very failed navy in their Japanese invasions, mind you, or they sent ahead specific groups in the military after they conquered somewhere or someone more often than not submitted to the Mongols. They had a special branch in the military that would study these cultures' inventions and sophistication and cultural attributes to see if there was anything that they wanted to add to their kind of hybridization culture that developed. So really it comes out of the Enlightenment with writers like Voltaire that slander the Mongols, and it's not very enlightened thinking to do that, because actually they're quite the opposite. They're very, very sophisticated.
I'd like to ask you now about how in the 19th century, actually, let's start with Charles Darwin. When he was sailing around the world, during his time in South America, he found a tooth. How he could recognize that this belonged to an ancestor of the horse. How did he know this when he looked at it? Did it puzzle him to find this tooth there?
So horse equine dental schematics are very specific, which again, these attributes lend itself to the utilitarian purposes for human beings. But, don't look a gift horse in the mouth or straight from the horse's mouth. They develop very specific dental schematics to be able to eat grass, long story short, which changes the configuration of their face and the long muzzle. Their eyes move up in their head and to the side so they can see almost 360 around while they're still eating, because they're not ruminants. They're hindgut digesters in something called a cecum. So their stomach is very small, but the cecum is a massive tank, whereas ours is super tiny as a vestigial kind of leftover from our own mammalian evolution, whereas our stomach is bigger. So they develop a very unique kind of teeth to anus digestive system in how they process grass, which enables them to eat something that is essentially a worthless thing to eat. It's actually, by eating grass, it's the bacteria and the fungus and the protozoa in their stomachs that actually form the meal, not the grass itself, because they try to use these things to break down the walls to get the cellulose walls to get the nutrients out of the grass. But they end up essentially eating that bacteria and protozoa as the protein. So it's a very unique system, but horse teeth are unmistakable. Most animals' teeth are unmistakable, and that's if you're an archaeologist and you look at teeth, it's whether it's human beings. So our teeth change dramatically when we look at skeletons when we start to farm, because we're eating grains. And I don't mean nice white flour like today. I mean very rawly kind of broken up grains, whether it's rice, whether it's wheat. So our teeth wear down horribly. So you can tell if someone was a hunter-gatherer or a farmer based on their teeth. And you can see that shift in the skeletal record in humans. So he knows it's a horse tooth or an equine tooth, and he's very confused about why it's there and why it's in the strata, the archaeological strata that it is, because at this time, everybody believes equine evolution happened on the Eurasian steppe. So he doesn't understand why it's there, and he brings it back to England, and then there's two essentially evolutionary trees or studies going on, one in England and one in the US, and they don't actually hook up to realize that the Hyracotherium, or the dawn horse, what the Americans call it, is the same animal until later on in the 1800s. And it's an American who figures out that the horse evolved in what is now the United States, but it takes a while to connect the two simultaneous investigations of equine evolution going on, one in Europe and one in the Americas. It's like Thomas Huxley is the British guy doing this, and Othniel Marsh is the American, and eventually Huxley comes in. Huxley's called Darwin's bulldog, his nickname. He's a disciple of Darwinian evolution. And when he comes to America in 1876, they finally connect a lot of the dots because the two of them become best friends and hang out, Marsh and Huxley, which I describe in the Bone Wars. And it's just kind of a cool chronology of how this all happens.
Yeah, I thought the way you described the history of the Bone Wars, that it could make for a pretty interesting movie. It's sort of Indiana Jones-like in a way, but in real life.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, some of this, and obviously I have to keep the chapters somewhat short, but I could have written obviously a lot more. And some of the stories were just like, what these archaeologists are doing to each other is crazy. Like literally trying to kill each other. Because there was so much money involved in the right at the embryonic stage of paleontology, there was huge money and fame in dinosaur bones. And this is when this is kind of taking place in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, all over the world, not just in the American, Canadian West, and so it was fortune and fame, and they are cutthroat and ruthless. But yeah, it would make for a very good movie.
You wrote that the horse in its medieval agricultural revolution transported the West to the threshold of the modern age. Could you give an example of how it played that role?
So this is back to what I mentioned about the accessories we add to the horse. So this is when it happens earlier in China with this combination of an actual horse collar, like a collar that's made specifically for horses, not an oxen collar, because they're different anatomical structures. The one used for oxen actually choked the windpipe of the horse. So it was a specifically drawn horse collar that rests on the chest of the horse to maximize its drawing power. So these are all Chinese inventions. And when we combine harnesses, horse collars, whippletrees with the moldboard plow, a better plow, and horseshoes, they all come together in Europe, where we have all of these things beginning kind of around the year 950, 1000, let's say. So when you combine all these things with traction with horseshoes, a proper horse collar, the trace harness system with the whippletrees to a moldboard plow, it allowed Europeans to actually have enough power to plow deeper into the wet, kind of thick, heavy soils of Europe to be able to farm places in Europe that they couldn't farm before. So we see a huge population spike, and then what comes out of the horse and these attributes is what is now known as the commercial revolution, really between the year 1000 and 1300 in Europe, where we see just so much trade going on, and this coincides with the later advance of the Mongols. And all of this trading happening and spurred by the Norse as well, because the Norse are 700 to kind of 1000. So they have got trade going as well. And it kind of culminates in this commercial revolution in Europe. And that is largely brought about by an increase in agricultural production, where Europeans are producing surplus agriculture really for the first time, in large surplus agriculture for a capitalist commercial market, which leads to population increases, population densities. The rise of the big cities in Europe happens at this time. And then obviously all of this comes to a culmination or head with the Black Death, because what Europe's created by this molten wealth flowing through Europe, the rise of the church, and huge densely populated cities is a cordial welcome for the plague. So, and then the Renaissance following that. So this is where it's not just the horse, but it's all these attributes we add to the horse come together to create a much more powerful animal to be able to plow heavy, heavy, heavy soils.
You told an interesting story of horses that served in the Battle of Waterloo, and how some of them that were injured were auctioned off. And there was a doctor named Sir Astley Cooper purchased
he was the
12
king's
of these
personal.
horses.
Yeah, he was the king's personal physician, Astley Cooper. Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. I was just going to ask you if you wouldn't
I'm
mind
glad you mentioned
telling.
his name because I didn't remember his name off the top. I have a lot stored up here, but I couldn't remember his name off the top of my head. So after the battle, yes. Well, these stories are both great. So the Duke of Wellington's horse is very famous in like horse kind of lore and mythology. It's one of the most famous, other than obviously Bucephalus and race horses. But his name was Copenhagen, and he was a very big horse. And so during the Battle of Waterloo, Wellington was on his horse for 17 hours straight in combat and in conducting moving troops and doing his job. And so when he finally got off the horse, he went to pat the horse on the muzzle to say, like, good job, thank you, because obviously they're friends and had been through a lot together over the years. And the horse bit him. So it's like, I thought that was humorous that the horse is like, no, man, 17 hours. He is basically his best friend and he bites him. But the Dr. Astley Cooper, so he was obviously a very wealthy man and owned in Herefordshire, sprawling estate in Herefordshire as the king's personal physician. So he adopts a bunch of badly wounded horses from the Battle of Waterloo, who were, grape shot and shrapnel and burns and awful. And he and his team rehabilitate, these kind of dozen or so horses and, put them out on his meadows to kind of live out the rest of their life in peace and solitude. And he watched one morning shortly after he released them onto the downs. They got together in perfect cavalry formation and did a cavalry charge and perfect drill, and then kind of scattered and went about grazing and doing their thing. And they did this every single morning. And he would watch teary-eyed these, horses who've obviously had horrific trauma, and obviously we know animals get PTSD too, conduct this perfect cavalry drill and charge every morning before they'd scatter to enjoy their peaceful, I guess, the rest of their lives on his estate. So it's it's a heartwarming story, but it's also kind of a terrible story to think about how traumatized these poor animals must have been.
Yeah, mixed emotions with that story. It certainly is interesting.
That also speaks to how well trained they were as well, I suppose.
Right.
Unlike the horse, they trained to walk backwards for King George's coronation, because
that was a funny story.
They didn't, because the king's obviously not quite all there, as we know from the villain of Hamilton, like the American Revolution. So they trained this horse so he would walk in to the coronation, but then walk backwards out so the king didn't have to look at his rear end. Well, the horse comes in and he turns around, he walks backwards to the king and then walks forward out of the room. So the king had to stare at his butt the entire time. And I either think the horse was terribly trained or he wanted the king to be the butt of his joke, pardon the pun, and did it on purpose. But that's also a very funny story.
I'd like to ask you about something called the Equine episodic, or the Influenza of 1872. You wrote that this event reminded people of the position of the horse in society. Could you say briefly what that was?
So by 1872, imagine big cities. Toronto's a big city. New York is huge. All these big cities we think of today, they're big by this time. They're millions of people by this time. So imagine everything today we do with the internal combustion engine. So cars, transport trucks, lorries, planes, ship, everything. So we use horses for all of that, for all of our needs, whether it's groceries, whether it's transporting goods, whether it's agriculture. So think of tractors and combines. All of this is done by the horse. Mills are run by horses, like subways. It's horses, like huge omnibuses that are pulled by, big teams of horses in downtown New York City and Baltimore and these big cities. So try to imagine, if you look out your window, everything that's moving mechanically was a horse. So that's kind of the setup. So in 1872, there's an outbreak of equine influenza A that starts actually in Toronto and moves its way down New York State and into the United States and eventually into Mexico and the Caribbean. I mean, it is literally a pandemic in the Western Hemisphere. And so it shuts down society. Like in the firsthand accounts, which I put in the book, the primary sources, and I say it sounds exactly like COVID, like exactly what happens. It is pretty stunning, actually, the descriptions of this society where you have, all the storage containers at the docks just rotting, or like can't move them. The horses are all sick or dying. Or in the train stations, all the goods are just piled up, all the agricultural goods rotting because you can't get them to the trains, or you can't get them from the fields to the trains. Or the horses that pulled the fire engines in Boston, there's a huge fire in Boston and they don't have any horses to put out the fire, and downtown Boston just burns. It's an amazing story of thinking about the often, I guess, underappreciated horse at that time, and people realized just how important these animals were to everything. I mean, obviously from an economic standpoint, but transportation and getting to your job. I mean, all of it. It would be like having no cars, no subways, no fire trucks, none of it. The world would shut down. And it literally did for a few months in 1872 across mostly the United States, and parts of southern Ontario and Quebec.
I found really interesting the parts of your book that talked about how horses were used in the First World War and the Second World War. Perhaps to summarize the questions into one larger one, you wrote how the first decades of the 20th century saw the peak of human dependency on horses, followed by its sudden end.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can do this fairly quickly. As the Model T comes out in 1908, and America is blessed with the two twin pillars of industrialization, which is petroleum and steel. So America mechanizes very quickly. We see a motorized society in the United States during the interwar years. I mean, take off. It's I don't want to say it's overnight, but in the U.S., we see this shift from horsepower to horsepower, the internal combustion horsepower, in the interwar years. I mean, it is almost a complete overhaul of the United States transportation system. The Americans have all the roads in place too, so it's actually fairly easy from horse to car because of the infrastructure in the U.S. is already there. But no other country does that. So I think it's a little bit misleading because the U.S. does it so quickly, and Canada and Britain are 2 and 3, but they're way behind. When we look at Europe does not really motorize until after the Second World War. And that's when we see the rest of the world catch up to the United States is after the Second World War. So that's why it's a bit misleading, is because, well, for us being Canadian, we think of it happen fairly quickly, and it does in the U.S. and to a lesser extent in Canada. But the rest of the world really doesn't motorize with cars and buses and the like until after the Second World War. So that plays into the fact that the First World War was a horse-driven war for all armies for the most part. Yes, there's some mechanization that comes in with armored cars and motorcycles and some trucks and airplanes, but it's still a horse war. There's 16 million horses served in the First World War. It's the biggest of any war by far, with 8 million dying. So when we get to the Second World War, because the Americans motorized so quickly, the Allied armies, Canada, Britain, and America, are 100% mechanized. We use no horses. Whereas the Germans actually use more horses in the Second War than they do in the First, because their society is not mechanized. They don't have the infrastructure for a mechanized society. So their military is actually, at best, 15% mechanized at the outbreak of war when they invade Poland. By 1944, when we invade Normandy, the Germans are 10% mechanized. So this myth of the Juggernaut Blitzkrieg is just that. It's wonderful propaganda, showing these movie reels of this German mechanized juggernaut on behalf of Joseph Goebbels. And they So, but it's not. The Nazi army is run by oats, not oil. And as I joke in the book, it's far more ponies than panzers, which is also why we're able to defeat it, is because the Western allies are 100% mechanized, and the Russians on the Eastern Front are becoming increasingly mechanized as the war progresses because of the American Lend-Lease, and just the sheer volume coming out of American and Canadian industry is ridiculous. And a lot of that is going to the Red Army.
I'd like to ask you about how have horses played a role in the development of human rights over the last, say, century?
Well, in the last century, I mean, not the last century, but I think in history, we see anybody can own a horse, and it kind of subverts power or gains power depending on who has horses. But we do see females who become, well, we have the Amazons are real. They're Massagetai. They're a group of Indo-European Scythian peoples who are matriarchal and are run and ruled by women. And they actually kill Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, and Queen Tomyris chops his head off and turns the skull into a gilded drinking cup for her wine, which is actually a true story. So, and we see women attain high ranks in the Chinese, the early Han dynasties. So it's able to kind of subvert or gain power. In the last century, I mean, it allows the internal combustion engine allows the horse to finally get some independence, which I'm sure it's thankful for. Because we have to remember that horses were conscripted into our service, whether the causes were noble or nefarious, and they didn't get a choice in this. And urban horses and obviously military horses, they went through a hell of an ordeal. And so they were treated terribly and suffered horribly. So the average lifespan of a horse is about 30 years. But for an urban horse in the mid to late 1800s, it's 7 years. Which speaks to how, I mean, again, they're treated like a machine, not so much a sentient being, if you will, because they spin and provide profit for greedy humans. It's not a nice way to say it, but it is true.
I have just a couple more questions I'd like to ask you. One of them, you describe throughout the book that humans and horses have this unbreakable bond throughout history. I'm interested in your take on what the future of that bond is.
So the kind of an easy way to answer this is the estimates of the highest global horse population is kind of between 1915 and 1920 on the planet. And we're looking at kind of 130 to 150 million horses on the planet, somewhere in that 1915 to 1920 time period, where there's still roughly 58 million horses on the planet today. And so I think the horse just kind of redefines its role within our symbiotic or shared history. So obviously we still use horses in like crowd control with police, like mounted officers. Certain countries still have true cavalry units in their military. The Americans, Canadians, Chinese, we did use horse soldiers, literal horse soldiers in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in Bosnia. So they're still used for specific military roles in hard to reach areas, I guess, where we can't get, LAVs and the rest of our motorized military vehicles. There is a push to true green farming, where people are using horses again to farm in the true sense of green farming. And there's a huge increase in the use of horses in equine-based therapy for PTSD, for not just soldiers, but all people with post-traumatic stress, at-risk children, inmates. So this is the big one, is this equine-based therapy. And you're seeing these institutions pop up all over the world. And obviously as recreation and as pets. And then we're also seeing whether listeners like it or not, back to the original purpose of horses, we're seeing an increase in horse becoming on dinner plates. 1 billion people on the planet currently consume horse meat regularly, and it's becoming more of a farmed race meat as well. Since the 1990s, I believe horse consumption has gone up 23%, if I remember my statistics. But so we're seeing that go up too. I mean, I know that might be hard to digest for some of the listeners, but it's the original use of horses, and it's still very prevalent. So I think it just redefines its kind of purpose to humanity. And I mean, we all, whether you ride horses, own horses, don't own horses, we're all just drawn to horses because they're just part of who we are. And I mean, as a kid, I would just stare at them at the petting zoo and be mesmerized by their coats and their muscles and how big they were. And yet they move kind of so gently a lot of the time when they're just moving slowly and like being a horse. So I think they're just part of, I kind of close the book with, I'll paraphrase this statement, but humans aren't humans without horses, and horses aren't horses without humans. And it's just this innate relationship and understanding that we have. And I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
Yeah, it's well said. I like that. There's a city in southern Japan on the island of Kyushu called Kumamoto. And if visitors go there, one of the famous delicacies of that area is to eat something called basashi, which is raw horse. Is that something you'd be open to trying if you came to Kumamoto?
I've eaten horse before.
Have you? Yeah.
Horse is extremely, when we look at it from, well, horse milk too. Horse milk is extremely nutrition in the vitamins and minerals that it has compared to cow's milk. So horse milk is, way healthier than cow's milk as far as what you get from it. And it's very low in fat. It's kind of 2% milk fat as well. It has a high lactose content, which is why they ferment it, but that's a separate story. Horse meat is way higher in protein and iron than the leanest beef. And I mean 50 and 30% higher. And it has both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, which is rare in ruminants. You don't get both. So it's extremely healthy. But obviously, if you look at a horse, it's extremely lean. So eating it raw, or I equate it to when you cook venison or elk or caribou or moose meat, any of those kind of wild game, you have to cook it. If you overcook it, it's like eating a leather shoe. I mean, it's because they're so lean. So I've had horse meat, and it was on numerous occasions, and it was delicious. And again, I'm sorry if listeners are offended by that, but it was tasty.
So I have to ask you, you grew up in southern Ontario, very close to the American city of Detroit, cheered for the Detroit Red Wings, but since 2012 lived in Colorado. I'm wondering if you've switched allegiance to the Colorado Avalanche, or you still cheer for
No, I'm still
Detroit
a Red Wings fan, and I'm still a Lions fan. But the thing is I always like the Broncos too. So I cheer for the Broncos because I'm a little bit older, so I remember being a kid in the Elway days and loving the Broncos as well. So I'm a Lions fan first and foremost, but I've always liked the Broncos as well. And I've always liked the Avalanche too. So, and I have friends who work in the Avalanche organization. So, I get to go to games quite frequently and, meet the players and the rest of it. So I'm an Avs fan too, but I'm certainly still a Red Wings fan at heart, but I do like the Avalanche. I mean, watching Nathan McKinnon play and Cale Makar, you can't go wrong with that. Whether you like the Avs or not, that's just fun hockey. So
yeah, they're amazing players. So the last thing I want to ask you, Tim, is if people want to follow what you're doing or find your books or see what's going to come next, where can they go? Yeah,
so I have no social media. I never have, and I never will. I'm that guy. There's two of us left in the world, me and my dad. I'm just not a big fan of cell phones or social media, and in my own opinion, what that's done to society, I think any positive that has come from it is far outweighed by the negative in my opinion. So it's a bit difficult to kind of keep track of me, but I do I'm not going to say what it is, but actually just last week, Penguin agreed to another proposal for another book. So I do have another book coming out, probably be out in like, by the time I'm done, 3 or 4 years by the time research and writing and being obviously publication. So I guess the best way would be to keep track of, I mean, Penguin Random House has a little thing on me. Colorado Mesa University has a little bio on me. I just like to be under the radar and do my thing, and I'm a small town Canadian boy. I don't need the rest of it. I want to live a simple life.
That's fair. Sounds good. I really appreciate your time to meet with me today, and your book, The Horse, A Galloping History of Humanity, was incredibly well researched, very well written, and I enjoyed it immensely. So thank you very much.
Of course, you're very welcome.